Yeah, welcome back to Two Brothers and Bitcoin with me, the amazing Chad McBain, and I'm Luke McBain. And we wanted to look at like the basically the outflows of Trump signing the strategic Bitcoin reserve into effect. And one of the outflows was that, as you just said in the previous installment, was that it wasn't a real outflow. But let's say there was an announcement that there would be a European digital currency, which is antithetical to Trump's policy, who said under him there won't be a digital dollar. Like that's one of his promises he made, and doesn't seem very likely that there will be a digital dollar. But apparently, the EU wants a digital currency, a digital euro. And so that's already antithetical in terms of policy, but they then go a step further and say, well, the US policy on establishing a Bitcoin slash cryptocurrency reserve is threatening our sovereignty because, and there was this, hypothetical that, well, that might be a method of payment in the future across these US giant tech firms that, like Facebook and X, that they might say, okay, now we know we can use these stable coins. The US government is not hostile anymore towards these alternative forms of payment. Maybe they are, I don't know. But apparently, if they have them in their strategic reserve, then maybe we can accept them as payment. And this could be a next step. And then we also accept this kind of payment in the European Union. And there's already a little bit of tension there because freedom of speech, or the EU basically wanting, or already, of course, curbing freedom of speech on these platforms for their citizens, but they also want to do it for US citizens. And the
Mhm.
US is saying, well, we don't want any of that. We don't want you to censor our citizens' right for free speech on these platforms. So there's already some tension there. That tension could increase, and then you might have the sovereignty problem. I don't know. It's not like in the article we looked into, it wasn't like fleshed out in this degree, and I'm using my imagination here a little bit to try to figure out what the problem could be, why this could undermine sovereignty, because I don't know. Yeah.
Well, we can get into speculation in a minute. Why don't we actually let's start with speculation. So speculation is what you just said that there maybe there's a concern there that that they're launching of a euro central bank digital currency, a European one, um, which would obviously have a lot of financial control over its citizens of Europe. Um, with the U.S. embracing Bitcoin and maybe U.S. based stable coins backed by the U.S. dollar, that that Europe would be kind of left out in the cold in terms of its ability to truly issue a central bank digital currency that people would actually want to use when they can simply just look to the left and look to the right and see that other Westerners don't have to use a central bank digital currency, don't have their financial activity tracked and monitored and that kind of stuff. All the bad things that come with the central bank digital currency. So that's the speculation part. But let's now add some facts into this. The European Central Bank, and quite frankly, European politicians over the last number of years seem to be reacting quite negatively to US based tech companies, US based, and this all falls under tech, but US based internet search engines, US based social media platforms. Um, they've been cracking down on their citizens all across Europe. Different countries obviously have different rules and regs, but I think it's fair to say that in most European countries, you can't get away with maybe doing things on social media that you can get away with in the United States. I think that's fair to say. And you can't get away with things on social media that you could get away with even 2 or 3 years ago. So that's a fact. The other fact is there's a lot of wealth leaving Europe for a variety of reasons. Um, and I know the UK technically is no longer part of the European Union, but they're still considered part of Europe. So I know this for a fact. Last year alone, 10,000 millionaires left the UK. So there seems to be some capital flight leaving Europe. I've seen similar figures for France, by the way. Um, I think there's a lot going on there politically within Europe that relates to finances. And I think most European governments, not all, but many of them are scrambling for control and relevance when it comes to um, the finances of their countries. And their response seems to be to crack down on their citizens um, and to want to have more control over the currency. So central bank digital currency would definitely give them that control. Um, we only need to look to China to see what a central bank digital currency can be used for. Doesn't mean that it will, but it certainly can be used to usher in a social credit score, to um, to punish those that don't go along with the political motivations of the ruling class, and to reward those that they choose to reward. Um, if the U.S. goes in a different direction, whether we like to admit it or not, I'm in Canada, you're in Germany. Um, what the U.S. does has a lot of impact throughout the world in general, and particularly the Western world. And I think that probably frightens those in control right now at the European Central Bank. That the American administration has basically said, we want less control over our citizens' financial behavior. We're more interested in entrepreneurship and investment than we are about worrying about what happens to individuals and how they spend their money. So I think if Europeans see that, and they're going to see it and hear about it a lot on these U.S. Tech platforms, social media platforms, whatever, I think that really scares you. When you look at what some of the European politicians have accused Google of in the past few years, and Google's they try and stay out of the public spotlight for the most part. They don't tend to get involved in politics. The European countries, some of them, have really gone after, and I'm including the UK in this, have really gone after Google. They've really gone after X. They've really gone after Facebook. And, as somebody in Canada, I kind of look and think, well, how do you prevent your citizens from using these platforms? It's just the internet. So pretty soon I think they're going to attack the internet itself. I don't know. But anyway,
Have a
bring it back.
great European firewall, not a great Chinese firewall, but
Right,
they need
exactly.
something like
Yeah,
this. Yeah.
I could see that happening. I don't know. I'm not there, but bringing it back to the whole Bitcoin thing. Look, Bitcoin is the anti version of that. And when you think of currency, um, let's just say that one political ideology says we want a currency that we can control. We want a currency that we can control the use of. We want a currency that we can dictate behaviors of the people using the currency. And another administration is saying, yeah, we're not interested in any of those things. What we're interested in is growth, entrepreneurship, and investment. Now, that might not be that way forever, but currently I think that's the situation. And I have a funny feeling that that's where some of these vague comments are coming from European central bank leaders. I think they're really worried about the US administration um, adopting a Bitcoin reserve and also making it very clear that they like the fact that these stable coins are growing in usage exponentially, and almost all of them are backed by the by the US dollar. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, we discussed that in a also previous episode why the US is actually benefiting from stable coins, right? Like
Yeah.
this is something positive actually for the US Treasury, which is interesting, and I encourage everybody to look into that episode. I mean, maybe that's a struggle which has not been finally resolved. I mean, I'm just thinking of this topic of debanking people, and debanking also has happened in the United States and has happened also on other platforms, payment platforms like PayPal and Venmo and all that.
Yep.
Um, and
Happened here
that's
in Canada.
yeah, and it's still ongoing, and it's still also happening in Europe and Germany. Debanking is happening a lot. Not a lot of people know about this. It's really interesting. It's not really news. Like you talk about this and people go like, what are you talking about? People can't have a bank account? And what? That's unheard of. Like that's something people are really shocked to know. And then you go, no, yeah, you know what a PEP is? No, what's a PEP? What's a PEP? I said, it's a politically exposed person. Because I have recently had to sign something that I'm not a PEP. All right. So I
Right.
had to sign my to get an account. I'm not going to say the company, but I just like say I'm not a PEP.
Yeah.
So
Well,
and no,
I have to do it.
I'm just saying that because some of it might seem like a horror scenario. Oh, they will control who can use the digital currency for what. That's a scenario. It's not happening yet. But based on what we are seeing right now, that people can be debanked for being a PEP, well, they certainly could turn off your currency if you're a PEP. Like, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, let me give you two North American examples. I mean, the one of the reasons I think this administration is pro Bitcoin and is because Republicans, high profile Republicans, have been debanked, and it's now coming out. People can do their own research on this. Um, that if they didn't like your politics, the previous administration encouraged the debanking of certain high profile individuals, including the former president of the United States and his family, you know, including
Oh,
a Kennedy family member, you know, because, and that was before RFK Jr. got into the political arena. That's when he just wrote his book about, things that we're not going to talk about here.
right.
uh, so if you can debank a Kennedy, if you can debank the former president of the United States, that's way too much power for a government. And then, of course, here in Canada, we go along sleeping through most things, and we're happy to do so. And quite frankly, our lives are pretty sedate. And then we had the trucker convoy and protests a few years ago. Now, people can take whatever side of that they want. I'm not offended either way. But what shocked me was they went and the Canadian government got GoFundMe to freeze donations and forfeit those donations to the government.
Well,
And they seized the bank accounts of the protesters, which I don't believe had ever been done in the history of this country. Um, and and what really actually got me upset was they froze the bank accounts of anybody that donated more than $50 to that protest. Now, for those that don't remember, that protest was a legal protest until the government made it illegal. Okay, fair enough. There is a drop dead date. I believe it was around February 15th, 2022. But they still froze the accounts of everybody prior to that illegal date. So if you donated on February 7th, when it was still technically a legal protest, you still had your account frozen. So we have examples right here in North America of people being debanked just for their political views or their social views, not being in line with the current administration. Can you imagine what would happen if these banks, if these governments issued their own digital currency? I just think it's a dystopian nightmare for anybody who has an opinion on pretty much anything, the color of the sky, whatever. So I'm not sure what's going on in Europe. I don't live there, but from North America's perspective, when we see people getting arrested for silently praying, um, that's interesting in a concerning sort of way. And when we see right here in North America, some of our political leaders and certainly political influencers getting debanked, that these are things that are happening. So it's no surprise to me that the current administration is pro Bitcoin because you couldn't do that with Bitcoin. You couldn't stop you and I from transacting in Bitcoin.
hmm.
Even if the government decreed it, you couldn't stop it. We might choose not to, but you couldn't actually stop it.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, I think the European administrations of obviously we're talking about many countries in Europe, but when we're talking just about the European central bankers, they seem to be in line in their philosophy, and they seem to like the idea of controlling the population from a currency perspective. Now, they pass that along as it'll be convenient for the citizens to use, and it will be convenient. There's no doubt about that. But I think there's a lot of bad things that come with it. Now, that's all the one aspect. I'm just going to touch briefly on the other. You talked about the stable coins. Stablecoin usage now, I believe, um, is now US dollar backed stablecoin usage is now in the top 10 in the world. And what I mean by that is if you were to take stablecoin, US backed stablecoin usage in the world and put them into a country, that country would now rank in the top 10 of all countries in terms of buying and backing US dollars. So stable coins, something that most people in Europe and in Canada don't even know anything about,
Yeah. Yeah.
have now become a major backer of the US dollar. So even the previous administration in the US, and most certainly this one, is, I think, looking at this and saying, oh, these crypto things that we don't know much about is actually making our position as the U.S. hegemony of the U.S. dollar is making it stronger than it's ever probably been, moving in to a digital era.
Mhm.
So if I'm, and I don't know what goes on in Europe from a banking perspective, but if I'm a European central banker, I'd be terrified by that. Over the last few decades, we've seen the US lose a little bit of its dominance in terms of the global reserve currency. And now these stable coins are bringing it right back, to probably even at their current pace, it'll make the US dollar more stronger than at any time probably in history post World War II
And and
at
I'm
its current.
and are people what I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right. I don't think anybody knows this thing about stable coins, and maybe we should do like a separate session just on that.
Sure. Yeah.
Because I think people don't like people might know about Bitcoin, but stable coins just one bridge too far. And now you're saying this, and like what are they being used for? Like, are they being used for anything? Or are people just buying them and keeping them like Bitcoin, or are they actually buying
No,
stuff
they're
with
they're
stable
they're
coins?
being used for trade all over the world by financial markets, traders, you name it. And they're trading in and out of whether it be cryptocurrencies or other currencies into these stable coins because they're US dollar backed. It's basically just trading a digital dollar. But instead of that digital dollar being issued by the European Central Bank or by the United States Federal Reserve, those digital dollars are issued by these private companies. But for the people using them, they don't care. They're buying online US dollars is basically what they're doing.
Hmm.
And they're
Hmm.
they're trading in and out of it all the time. So you could be doing a trade, a currency trade in Japanese yen and US dollars. You wouldn't do it in Japanese yen or sorry, in US dollars. You would do it in a stable coin. It's just easier, faster. And the big one is there's virtually no fees. There's a small fee, but it's nothing compared to if we did it through the bank or we did it through a stock exchange. Yeah. So that's where they're being used from. But now, particularly in parts of, do we still call them the third world? But a lot of people are now doing their remittances back to their home countries in these stable coins
Oh, okay. Okay.
because the fees are so low. So if I
Okay.
was to send, I don't know, if I was to send $100 Western Union to, let's say, the Bahamas, um, I might have to pay $15 in transaction fees. So my family member in the Bahamas would get $85, not 100. If I used a stable coin to do it, I'd send $100 and they'd get $99.98. So for remittances, it's being adopted very quickly throughout much of the world.
Oh, that's very interesting. Very
Yeah.
interesting.
So there's and we could go on, but those are just two examples of this is where this use case is coming from. And when you think about it, just from those two things, you can see very quickly how this isn't going to stop. It's actually going to grow very quickly, you know? So, yeah.
So there's,
So,
yeah, interesting. So there's a big use case also. Like there was always this criticism of Bitcoin that there's no use case because the transaction costs are so high for Bitcoin. But now in this particular case, you're saying, well, it is actually, I mean, Bitcoin in some cases is actually used not maybe here in the West, but in developing countries. And then you're saying, well, stable coins are also even used in developing
Well,
countries. So
and
yeah.
here's the thing. So, and this is, again, this is probably a controversial topic, but I urge people to just think about this, not for who's right or who's wrong, but just the mechanics of this. After the United States seized all the Russian gold, Russia used stable coins to move around currency. And people are, oh, well, stable coins are bad. Okay, fair enough. But when Russia tried to block the Ukraine from moving certain currencies around, the Ukraine used stable coins. They used Bitcoin. So what the point I'm trying to make is everybody can use decentralized stuff. Nobody can stop it. There's good things about that. There's bad things about that. But at the end of the day, you can see why these are going to grow, not not shrink.
Hmm.
The use case is too great, you know. So, someday it's fine. Right now, the U.S. is on top of the world. Blah 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 blah. Maybe in 20 years, the U.S. has to worry about Russia blocking their stuff. They can use stablecoins. They can use Bitcoin. Maybe some countries in Europe are worried about getting invaded by another country in Europe. That's happened in the past. um, they can use these things. They don't have to worry about moving gold around on ships or trains or trucks. They could just transact this way. You know, so it's a pretty it's technology. It's currency technology, and but the big thing is there's virtually no fee, very, very small fees. It's almost instantaneous. Um, and the mechanics to move the large sums of money is a click of a button, not ships, not trains, not trucks, and you don't have to run down to your bank. So I
Yeah.
don't use them, but there's a strong use case there, I think, moving forward for much of the population of the planet.
And we only have a couple of minutes left. Should we end with one of the articles which you shared
Sure.
with us?
Yep.
Which one? Like, we still have a couple of them. I mean, maybe that the case of now, what is here? Let me see this about the banks, because also interesting to see this development. Again, I mean, there's so much news going on, positive news in terms of Bitcoin. Again, here it says Cantor Fitzgerald to expand Bitcoin financing amid US policy shift. And this is based on this piece of news here. Let me just make this a little bit bigger. The SEC recently rescinded staff accounting bulletin 121, which had previously blocked banks from offering Bitcoin custody services. Following this, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency clarified that banks are now permitted to engage in Bitcoin and crypto services, included asset custody. So this is again, this is another piece of development which probably a lot of people don't know about, but which of course again is a game changer, right? I mean, that
Yeah.
banks
So
are now permitted to to offer Bitcoin custody services.
yeah. So as somebody who believes in the freedom of Bitcoin, I'm mixed about this because part of me is like, I wouldn't want a bank custodying my Bitcoin. But having said that, in terms of making Bitcoin mainstream, this is a huge deal. Um, and from the bank's perspective, they can now start. There's a new world that they can now start getting into, which is they can now start custodying Bitcoin the same way they would custody your dollars. They can charge fees for that. They can do investment advice, money management advice. And I think the big one here, Luke, is they can now start lending as using Bitcoin as the collateral,
Oh,
right?
okay. Oh, yeah.
And there are companies doing that right now, but they're not, the big banks aren't allowed to do it. So the big banks are looking at some of these companies making all this money in loans and fees, and they're like, we're not legally allowed to participate. So now they're legally allowed to participate. And so now you're going to see the JP Morgans of the world who've been talking trash about Bitcoin forever. Now they're going to start offering custody services and actually know that as a fact. So that JP Morgan, and Bank, I can't remember, it's Bank of America. There's another, Morgan Stanley, thank you. Um, Morgan Stanley is actually already ahead of the curve. Uh, Bank of New York Mellon, and of course Cantor Fitzgerald. So there's a lot of banks right out of the gate that are ready to go. So um, this time next year, you'll be able to walk into your JP Morgan investment account and your 100,000 or $200,000 Bitcoin. You can say, I'd like to take out a 20% loan on my Bitcoin, and they'll give it to you.
That is a big, big, big change. Yeah. So it's like an any asset. It's like a piece of property,
Yeah.
and you put it up for collateral, and you will receive a loan in fiat currency, which well, that's your decision, but you can do that, and it's a huge, yeah, it's huge. I agree, it's totally huge because again, that's another, let's say, step how to cement Bitcoin and crypto into like the general financial framework. It's just going to be another building
Uh,
block. Yeah.
and for those who do own Bitcoin, and yes, a lot of people that own Bitcoin are leery about banks, and they certainly don't want fiat currency, but they do still have to live. So you do still have bills to pay. But the nice thing about the banks now getting into this is if you need to, your engine goes in your car and you don't have the 5,000, but you certainly have some Bitcoin, you don't have to sell your Bitcoin now. You simply go to the bank and say, here's 10,000 in Bitcoin. I'd like a $5,000 loan secured against my Bitcoin. And they'll say, sure, because the collateral is right there. It's guaranteed. Like they don't have to send out an appraiser. They don't have to do anything. It's literally like walking into the bank with a bar of gold and saying, you hold this and give me some fiat money in return.
And get
And
some interest rate. And the good news is you don't have to sell your Bitcoin. That's the most
right.
important
Yeah.
part of the
Yeah.
story.
So look, as much as I don't like the banks and I don't want to save in fiat currency, I do live in the real world, and you do need fiat currency
Yeah,
to survive. So this is a great thing, and for the banks, it's another way to make more money. So
yeah.
yeah, so
Well, everybody's happy. So are we. Our time's up. And thanks again for this great conversation.
my
I
pleasure.
hope we have another one soon.
Sounds good. Look forward to it.
Take care now.
See ya.